Someone just has to tell her.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center on a pleasant spring Wednesday. Really delighted today to be joined by Cathy Kraninger, who, as you all know, is the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Cfpb has been a central player, I think would be an understatement, in the financial regulation post-crisis, and I think also fair to say its creation and its actions have been an occasional source of some controversy and public interest, and so we are really pleased that we'll have an opportunity to really understand from Cathy what the kind of arc of her vision is going forward. Just to situate the conversation, on CFPB website, I think they really neatly describe the organization's mission as to protect consumers from unfair, deceptive, or abusive practices, and to take action against companies that break the law, as well as arm people with the information, steps, and tools they need to make smart financial decisions. So it's the 3 E's: empower, enforce, and educate. Last year, President Trump appointed and the Senate confirmed Cathy to serve as the director of CFPB, while she is the 5th person, I believe, to actually sit in the office, only the 2nd to actually be formally confirmed by the Congress, which I think provides a real opportunity and anchor to guide the organization. Director Kraninger is a native of Chagrin Falls, Ohio, which I have had the pleasure of visiting. She has had a broad career in public service, beginning with the Peace Corps, where she spent 2 years in the Ukraine, then worked on a number of different congressional committees. She's been in the leadership team at DOT, at DHS, and most recently at the Office of Management and Budget. And as this is the Bipartisan Policy Center, I can't help but note that the director's career in public service was sparked by an internship on the Hill with then Congressman Sherrod Brown. Some of you may be aware that now Senator Brown also has a casual interest in some of the issues before the CFPB, so I hope that relationship has stayed strong. CFPB is of incredible importance to all Americans, and it's really, I think, a great opportunity to hear from the director. Following her remarks, Pete Schrader, who covers financial regulation for Reuters, will lead a conversation. Pete's reporting career basically began in the financial crisis. He was hooked right off the bat. Prior to his time with Reuters, he spent several years at the Hill newspaper, and before that, focusing on the intricacies of the financial markets with the bond buyer. Pete, if you pay attention to the news, is one of the more prolific writers here in DC. I find that the depth of detail he brings and the accessibility of his stories are pretty unique. I think just this week, Pete's written on U.S.-China trade, on some of the swirling dynamics around Fed appointments, and also on the recent conclusions of the IMF on world's global financial security. So after Pete and Cathy begin a conversation, we are then going to have an opportunity for some audience engagement. We are anticipating a lot of interest, and so we're asking people to write down questions on some note cards, pass them to the aisle. We have some fleet-footed staff who will be collecting those so that Pete has a chance to make sure we're honing in on the issues of greatest interest. And so with that, really a pleasure, Director, to ask you to come share your thoughts.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to our hosts for the invitation and to all of you for coming today. I'm particularly honored to be at a forum focused on bringing people together from across the political spectrum to forge common sense solutions to the pressing issues that are facing our nation today. That's the approach that I am taking to advance consumer protection and the mission of the Bureau. I want to specifically thank Jason Grumet, the president of the Bipartisan Policy Center, as well as BPC staff, Shai Akabas and John Sarushian. BPC has supported dialogue on myriad issues, including the mission of the CFPB. As demonstrated by my introduction, I'm no stranger to public service. I started in the Peace Corps and served in the legislative branch at several cabinet agencies, and where I also supported several government startups. While my positions have largely been political appointments, I learned early on in my career that the responsibility and duty of public service is to carry it as a public trust. I worked under Secretary Mineta, former Democratic congressman and Clinton Commerce Secretary, who served as President Bush's Secretary of Transportation. He liked to say that there are no Democratic roads or Republican highways. While being mindful of the political environment and considerations, we focused on developing and promoting the right policies for the American people. We also engaged in robust and transparent discourse on what those right policies were, both internally and externally, with the many stakeholders who cared about those policies. I've adopted that model in my career, and I am bringing that to my leadership at the CFPB. On my first day on the job last December, I launched a 3-month listening tour. Over that time, I met with well over 400 consumer groups, state and local government officials, faith leaders, military personnel, academics, nonprofits, financial institutions, former and current consumer advisory committees to the Bureau, and consumers. I've also met with and heard from the talented Bureau staff across the country and at headquarters. During these discussions, I heard a broad range of views about the Bureau, its work, and its future. I can tell you there is no shortage of opinions. Here are a few areas of consensus among the viewpoints that I heard. First, the CFPB's mission and the agency itself are critical to our economy and are not going away. A level playing field amongst financial services providers is an important goal. Bad actors harm consumers and undermine the integrity of markets, and they should be held accountable. All stakeholders express strong interest in protecting consumers, though they differ on the best way to accomplish that mutual interest. I want to thank everyone who shared their perspectives. These viewpoints have been indispensable in shaping my approach to executing the important mission of consumer protection. Today, I will lay out that approach and what it means to the Bureau and its partners. Notably, a continued commitment to engagement with all our stakeholders is a key part of that approach. In the wake of the financial crisis, Congress had a robust debate over splitting safety and soundness from consumer protection. Ultimately, Congress, through the Dodd-Frank Act, created the CFPB to be singularly focused on consumer protection in the market for financial products and services. Indeed, Congress clearly articulated the purpose and objectives of the CFPB. In summary, the Act states that the Bureau shall seek to implement and, where applicable, enforce federal consumer financial law consistently for the purpose of ensuring that all consumers have access to markets for consumer financial products and services, and that those markets are fair, transparent, and competitive. Congress gave significant powers and tools to the director to carry out that mission. Those tools include education, regulation, supervision, and enforcement, each of which serves an important component in the Bureau's execution of its mission. As director, I believe that the best application of these tools is to focus on prevention of harm to consumers. I will be talking about each of these tools in turn and how we will use them going forward to prevent consumer harm. After that, I will briefly address the challenge of measuring success in preventing harm, as well as our commitment to transparent, productive public discourse. Our first tool is education. Congress specifically charged the Bureau with conducting financial education programs and ensuring consumers receive timely and understandable information to make responsible decisions about financial transactions. The Bureau cannot be everywhere with everyone at every transaction, nor should it try to be. Therefore, empowering consumers to help themselves, protect their own interests, and choose the products and services that best fit their need is vital to preventing consumer harm and building financial well-being. With the multitude of public and private sector entities engaged in consumer financial education, I also want to ensure the Bureau uses its education tool where it is uniquely positioned to add value and provide leadership. Through the listening tour, I sought feedback from stakeholders about the value of our educational materials and how they're used. I listened to Bureau staff and other experts describe the approaches we've taken to financial education. Specifically, the Bureau recognized a gap and conducted extensive research to develop a consumer-centric definition of financial well-being that goes well beyond income and credit score. It captures a person's sense of financial security and financial freedom of choice in the present and the future. Core to that security is control over day-to-day and month-to-month personal finances, as well as the capacity to absorb financial shock. We have also found that consumers can experience financial well-being, or lack of it, across a wide range of incomes. It is tied to financial skills and confidence in those skills. Today's consumers need these skills more than ever. For example, fewer than half of Americans set aside money for their children's college education. More and more people reach retirement with incomes and savings that simply won't meet their needs. Perhaps most distressing to me was the Federal Reserve report that found 40% of Americans would turn to credit to cover a $400 emergency. That last statistic in particular caught my attention. Talked with nonprofits engaged in financial well-being education, fintech companies developing apps around savings, media personalities, members of our advisory committees, and CEOs of financial institutions, among others, who share that concern. As we collectively support Americans building financial well-being, tackling emergency savings is a logical place to start. It is a key element as people address the broader issues in their financial lives around attaining and retaining good credit, managing their debt, and maintaining a healthy habit of savings. To promote effective approaches to savings, and particularly emergency savings, the Bureau recently launched our Start Small, Save Up initiative. It offers tools and tips and information to help consumers build a basic savings cushion and develop a savings habit. Later this year, we'll be launching a savings bootcamp, a series of videos, and a very readable, informative booklet that serves as a roadmap to a savings plan. I encourage you to find out more about our website on Start Small, Save Up. Let me be clear, however. The ultimate goal for the Bureau is not to produce booklets and great content on our website. The goal is to move the needle on the number of Americans in this country who can cover a financial shock, like a $400 emergency. I'm committed to bringing together partners from across sectors to develop and execute a strategy to achieve that outcome. The collective investment in financial education in this country is substantial, and I believe we can increase the level of emergency savings by bringing these efforts together. I'm willing to listen, to promote the best practices of others, and to share or give credit, because this is not about promoting the Bureau or any one individual. I believe with the right coalition, putting our energy and talents towards this goal, we can significantly increase the level of emergency savings across the country, resulting in consumers taking control of their financial lives. I'm challenging all of you listening today to take this on with the CFPB. Our second tool for preventing consumer harm is rulemaking and guidance where appropriate. Articulating clear rules of the road for regulated entities that promote competition, increase transparency, and preserve fair markets for financial products and services. When Congress directs the CFPB to promulgate rules or address specific issues through rulemaking, we will comply with the law. Where the Bureau has discretion, we will focus on preventing consumer harm by maximizing informed consumer choice and prohibiting acts or practices which undermine the ability of consumers to choose the products and services that are best for them. To develop the best possible rules, the CFPB must use the best possible process. Because rules are general standards, they are not best articulated on a case-by-case basis through enforcement actions. Rather, they should be developed through a rulemaking process that is transparent, that allows stakeholders to submit comments, that reflects rigorous economic and market analysis, and that provides for judicial review. Ultimately, I don't believe anyone benefits from rules that are rushed out the door after having gone through a flawed process. Under my leadership, the CFPB will proceed deliberately and transparently in its rulemakings. Let me give you a concrete example of where all stakeholders have been seeking clearer rules of the road, and a CFPB rulemaking is designed to do exactly that. In the coming weeks, the Bureau will release proposed rules to implement the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. As many of you know, the act was passed in 1977. This is the same year that Steve Jobs introduced the world to the idea of a personal computer with the design of the Apple II. Phone booths were on almost every corner. There may be people in this room that have never seen a phone booth. And cell phones were not even imaginable. And though there have been many advances in communications technologies since 1977, the FDCPA has not been updated to reflect our use of these technologies. The Bureau will propose clarifying rules to better enable the use of modern communications technology in collections activity. The proposed rules also would protect consumers with clear, bright line limits on the number of calls they may receive from debt collectors on a weekly basis. We will propose to provide clarity on how collectors may communicate via newer technologies such as email or text messages. We will propose that collectors provide consumers with more and better information at the outset of collection to help them identify their debts and understand their options, including their rights in disputing debts or paying them. As the CFPB moves to modernize the legal regime for debt collection, we are keenly interested in the views of stakeholders and look forward to engagement with you. Given the prospective nature of rules combined with the unpredictable pace of change in technologies and markets, it is imperative that the CFPB be vigilant in evaluating the rules the agency has issued. Under the Dodd-Frank Act, within 5 years of the effective date of a significant rule, the CFPB must submit a report assessing the effectiveness of the rule in meeting the purposes and objectives of Title X and the goals stated by the Bureau. I believe Congress had great foresight in requiring the CFPB to determine whether our rules are working in the real world. Early in my tenure, the CFPB issued assessment reports addressing mortgage servicing and ATR-QM rules. We have more such efforts in the pipeline and have been discussing the best way to approach these assessments, even in the initial development of a rule. It is important to have baseline information when comparing data after the rule takes effect to understand whether the rules are protecting consumers and to evaluate costs and benefits. Further, the Bureau welcomes comment on our assessments to support stakeholder input over the effectiveness of our rules. I take seriously our responsibility under the law to reduce unwarranted regulatory burden and to consider the impact of rulemaking on regulated entities and consumers. The CFPB must acknowledge the costs that the costs imposed on regulated entities absolutely affect access to and the availability of credit to consumers. To that end, the Bureau continues to sift through the comments from the call for evidence last year, particularly organizing roughly 1,750 separate issues related to rulemaking. I have pledged to stakeholders that we will share our reaction to those comments through our development of the regulatory agenda and engage in a robust discourse on the relevant topics. The Bureau's work is not finished after educating consumers to help them protect themselves and writing rules that clearly articulate the legal requirements for institutions. The Bureau also has supervision authority that can prevent violations of laws and regulations from happening in the first place. To quote one of the Bureau staff in New York, people act differently when they know there's a regulator who will be checking their work. Bureau examiners can review compliance management systems at an institution to assess whether the institution is taking its obligations seriously and whether it has a culture of compliance that tries to prevent harm in the first instance. Supervision can uncover inattention to compliance and other internal controls that, if unaddressed, will lead to future violations. We can then suggest ways that the institution can make improvements that might stop this from happening. In fact, traditional banking institutions and non-bank lenders alike have noted the value of the exam process in supporting their compliance efforts. I heard it repeatedly during my listening tour. Heading trouble off at the pass may not grab big headlines, but it will prevent a lot of headaches for the consumers we serve. Just a few weeks ago, I visited an exam team on site at a bank. Bureau examiners walked me through the systems they use, the information requests they sent, the data they received back, and the steps they take to evaluate whether an institution is complying with its legal obligations. They talked about how they review an institution's compliance management systems. I was encouraged to hear their focus on working with the institution to prevent consumer harm, and I will encourage and expect this productive focus going forward. Over the past few months, I have met many of the Bureau's examiners and had the opportunity to hear their perspectives on the work they do and how we support them at headquarters. I have reiterated my view that supervision is the heart of this agency, particularly demonstrated by the percentage of our personnel and resources dedicated to conducting exams. I'm focused on ensuring we use this tool as effectively and efficiently as possible to prevent consumer harm. It is also imperative that the Bureau ensure consistent application in the use of our supervision tool. Focused on these goals for supervision, I've challenged the staff to take a fresh look at the entire process. The prioritization and frequency of exams, the size of the exam teams, the days spent on site, the system and job aids that support the work, the time it takes to complete an exam and deliver a report, and how we empower examiners to provide input on the exam process. From a substantive standpoint, to ensure a culture of compliance means working confidentially in a back-and-forth process with the institution to prevent consumer harm until the institution demonstrates that that kind of process won't work for them. Such an institution needs to self-examine, self-report, and provide restitution where appropriate. Given the pace of the world today, such institutions and consumers expect agility from the Bureau in terms of how quickly we can adjust to address changing risks, including how promptly we acknowledge that actual or potential harm has already been addressed. It is also important for us to keep in mind that the Bureau is not the only government regulator supervising any given entity. Financial institutions in this country are subject to myriad laws and regulations, all while being examined by a variety of federal and state regulators. In my short tenure, I've gotten to know my federal counterparts and am building strong relationships with them. I've also prioritized meeting and speaking with state attorneys general and commissioners at every opportunity. I recently assumed the chair of the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, a group of federal and state agencies that regulate financial institutions. As chair, my focus will be on strengthening coordination and collaboration with our sister regulators, who review the same or similar information at the same institutions, albeit for different reasons. It is incumbent upon us to ensure that we do not impose unmanageable burdens while performing our duties. A more efficient and effective deployment of resources towards monitoring and addressing the risks will help all agencies do their jobs better and will help the Bureau to prevent harm to consumers and address violations where they occur. Fourth, enforcement. Let me state emphatically my view that enforcement is an essential tool that Congress gave the Bureau, particularly because education, rulemaking, and supervision will not prevent every violation. There will always be bad actors who don't comply with the law. Ensuring that justice is served in the public interest, that is our goal in using the enforcement tool. Further, a purposeful enforcement regime can foster compliance, help prevent consumer harm, and right wrongs. My point about the importance of education is relevant as we think about enforcement. Even if we applied all the Bureau's resources to enforcement, the Bureau still could not investigate every potential violation, file a suit against every bad actor, or make every harmed consumer whole. For that reason, purposeful enforcement is about utilizing robust resources most effectively to focus on the right cases to reinforce clear rules of the road and prevent harm by making sure bad actors know they will be held to account. Public decisive action against wrongdoers sends a clear message to the marketplace that should deter unlawful behavior and support a level playing field, all while reaching a just outcome for harmed consumers in those particular actions. Enforcement is often a more deliberate tool in the Bureau's toolkit. It may take months or years to investigate and identify violations, develop reliable evidence, build a case, and reach a resolution through a settlement or litigation. I hope that our emphasis on prevention will mean that we need our enforcement tool less often. But when we do discover violations, enforcement is essential to hold wrongdoers to account, make things right for consumers, and deter future violations. I'm committed to ensuring that enforcement investigations proceed carefully and purposely to ensure a fair and thorough evaluation of the facts and laws. And I am also committed to ensuring that we move as expeditiously as possible to resolve enforcement matters, whether through public action or a determination that a particular investigation should be closed. To understand and evaluate this aspect of the Bureau's work, I've asked enforcement staff a number of questions in my many interactions with them over the past months. I'm digging in deeper to understand how potential violations come to enforcement, what challenges they face in obtaining information necessary for the investigation, how they quantify consumer harm, how they collaborate with state and federal partners, what the interactions are like with entities of interest and third parties, how the cases develop to reach my desk through a sue or settlement decision, and the time and resources applied to our investigations and litigation. I have experience working with law enforcement and can say at the Bureau, as elsewhere, each case is truly fact and circumstance specific. Many factors are weighed to determine the precise mix of restitution, penalties, and adjunctive relief appropriate in each case. At that center of that effort is serving justice in the public interest. As in the use of our other tools, the Bureau has a strong history of working with state and federal partners on its enforcement actions. This partnership is important to the execution of justice, and I am pleased that state attorneys general and supervisors have commended the work we have done on enforcement actions together. I want to take a moment to talk about how we measure success, given a focus on prevention of harm. I'll be frank, we're still working on that, because it's hard. But I will posit that the measures I have heard touted by others are not particularly satisfying either. They don't tell us much out of context. All too often, agencies tend to judge themselves by their outputs. For example, how many complaints did they handle? How many cases did they bring? How much money did they recover? But what do these types of metrics truly mean for the consumer financial system overall? If we succeed in fostering a culture of compliance and preventing harm, we would expect the number of complaints and the number of meritorious complaints to decline. We would likewise expect the number and the size of cases that are brought to shrink as well. Or a reduction in the number of cases filed could mean we're focused on more complex cases that take longer to develop. These questions underscore the challenge of focusing on outcomes and also demonstrate the incomplete lens of outputs. The Bureau's work must be measured by how well we use all of our tools to prevent consumer harm. In the coming years, we will be working within the Bureau and with our stakeholders to develop the most appropriate ways to measure progress in preventing harm. Before closing, I want to reiterate my commitment to engagement with all the Bureau's stakeholders. All of you want to prevent consumer harm and see consumers have access to fair, transparent, and competitive markets. The Bureau cannot achieve that outcome alone. That means ensuring transparent processes, fostering relationships and communication, valuing the expertise that others bring, supporting productive public discourse. There are a number of outstanding, challenging issues the Bureau is facing, some of which Congress directed us to address. And I believe that the best way to address these issues is with proactive dialogue. To that end, I am announcing that the Bureau will proactively convene a symposia series over the coming years on a variety of topics related to the Bureau's mission. This is building on the approach we took last year in convening experts on access to credit issues and credit invisibles. These types of proactive efforts are precisely how we intend to engage. The first topic for the Symposia series will be around clarifying the meaning of abusive acts or practices under Section 1031 of the Dodd-Frank Act. Congress gave the Bureau authority to protect consumers from unfair, deceptive, or abusive acts and practices and from discrimination, a fundamental and critical responsibility. Whereas unfairness and deception doctrines have been substantially developed under the FTC Act, abusiveness does not have the same record. While the statute defines abusive, some clarification, particularly with regard to reasonableness standards, may be useful. In last fall's Unified Regulatory Agenda, the Bureau stated that it is considering whether rulemaking or other activities may be helpful to clarify the meaning of abusiveness. We are now taking the next step to explore this issue. Our Symposia series will facilitate a robust discussion by experts on a given topic in a public forum. As the Bureau has an open mind on where the process will go, any appropriate next steps would come after the Bureau has had time to digest the discussion at the given symposium. I want to end where I began by thanking all of you and the BPC for giving me the opportunity to share my approach to the mission of the Bureau, my interest in effectively and efficiently using all of the tools Congress gave the Bureau to prevent consumer harm. As Benjamin Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If we can keep harm from falling upon consumers, we will be doing our job. It is my hope that this focus on prevention will drive us to that outcome. And to protect America's consumers, we will use all the tools Congress gave us, all of this agency's expertise and energy, and all our measured judgment, applied with humility and without fear or favor. Thank you.
So as the director takes her chair and Peach Schrader joins us, I want to apologize to the folks jammed into the hallway. I think, though, it is a clear indication of the interest in the Bureau and your leadership. I also want to remind everyone that we are eager for folks to write down questions on these cards. We have both fleet-footed and highly attuned staff looking for any nods of interest. And just like, you know, the good musician with the buck in the guitar case, I will cede the discussion with the first question that I hope Pete does not get to. I encourage you to write your names on the cards if you like, but however you'd like to submit your thoughts. And Pete, turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Director Kraninger, thank you so much for taking the time. Obviously, given his comments in the spillover crowd, there's a certain degree of interest in what you have to say here. And I think a lot of that is centered on the relative newness of the CFPB. I mean, realistically speaking, this is now the second full-time director that we've seen at this agency. And you've laid out in great detail in your remarks how you plan to kind of chart your own course. But I wonder if we could maybe start by just distilling that a little bit in terms of talking about what is your overarching goal for a Cathy Kraninger CFPB, and how is that going to be different from CFPBs that we've seen in the past?
Yeah. So I mentioned briefly, at least, I've been involved in a lot of government startups, and I truly appreciate the challenges in the early days of an organization and the opportunities, frankly, to assess freshly and look at how we mature the agency over time. So that's the stage at which I'm coming in. Setting that tone, frankly, of saying that we need to be open to the feedback of all of the stakeholders, that's our responsibility in public service to do that. It's massively challenging, as I said, because there are a lot of different viewpoints, but I think our goal is really to take that in and make sense of it and take the right policies forward in a really transparent way. And so that is what my overarching goal is in setting the tone for the agency under my tenure.
And regarding setting the tone, I mean, one of the kind of unique challenges in your position is that the Cfpb was built under Director Cordray and now Senator Warren, and the people who came to that bureau came subscribing to a specific vision of that agency. And now we're in a period of transition where there's now being a realignment of priorities, of resources, et cetera. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what your relationship is like with the rank and file Cfpb staff who perhaps came on thinking they'd be working for a certain sort of agency, and now are trying to kind of adjust to a new way of thinking about it.
I can tell you I've been truly impressed by the staff of the Bureau. There is no doubt that they are dedicated to the mission, they are committed, they are very capable and well educated. And from that vantage point, too, they have been very open to me. We've had some really fantastic conversations, and Bureau staff are part of those voices and part of that opinion about where we should go. I think fundamentally, though, it is a government agency. It is the director in whom Congress vested virtually all of the power and authority in the bill. And so at the end of the day, it's my direction and my responsibility to set that direction and tone for all of the staff. And I'd say they welcome it. Many of them talked about the fact that, again, in the early days, so many things were pressed upon them, so many things that people wanted them to do, and they tried to be everything to everyone in some respects. Setting priorities going forward and being judicious about those priorities and deliberate in our actions is what some of them have noted they're looking for, and I welcome that too.
And on a related note, I think one of the things that we've seen in the dynamic of the Cfpb since its inception really is that it's been a topic of intense political interest. It's been a partisan target in both directions. That's been true for any person in the leadership role in that seat, whether it was Director Cordray or Acting Director Mulvaney, and now a new seat in that seat as well. I'm wondering, do you think part of your mission is to try to move beyond kind of the partisan fervor, or would you like to get the Cfpb to a place where it's no longer kind of a constant existential argument about the agency every time it does something?
Yes. Yes, that is precisely what I'd like to do. I'll just send you around ahead of me, Pete.
But how do you go about doing that? I mean, you've laid out a vision for a measured, deliberate agency, but how do you do that in a way that potentially moves the institution beyond kind of the constant drama?
I do think that process is one of the ways that you do that. It can get boring and sound bureaucratic, but it really is about how you make sure that people understand where they can input, that their input is welcome, that we have avenues for that. And frankly, I think too, as I said, some of the folks internally, you may end up starting to feel like you're being bombarded such that you go hide in the corner. We're not going to do that. There is a constructive way to engage in that kind of conversation, take a path forward, and you know what, if it proves out, as I noted with the assessments of our rules, if things are not working the way they should or they're not as effective as they could be, being open to the fact that that's true and there's an iterative opportunity to improve. And that's the perspective that I'm trying to bring to this too.
And you, one of the sections of your speech you devoted to was on enforcement. Obviously, in the prior regime, enforcement was a very active tool at the Cfpb, utilized to great extent to try to kind of establish the boundaries of appropriate behavior. And you seem to be trying to lay out a slightly different course, a more measured, deliberate course, another, perhaps placing enforcement as less of an overarching priority and using other tools instead to try to achieve the same sort of goal. And I'm curious if you could just maybe elaborate a little bit more on how you think of enforcement as a CFPB director. Is it about just seeking out the truly bad actors and punishing them, or is it about trying to establish boundaries of appropriate behavior? How do you think about utilizing that tool?
I think, as I noted, all of the tools are important, and I am trying on purpose to put that prevention of harm lens out there to say there's a way at least to focus our efforts and think about them from that vantage point, including enforcement. We had some debate over, the word harm. I can't get everything into one speech, so how do we want to define harm? How do you define bad actor? Again, we can think of the most egregious things and probably all agree that that's a bad actor, but where are their gray lines? So a lot of things to dig into over time that I certainly, again, welcome the dialogue on, but the enforcement tool is very much one to go after, again, those egregious cases, to address violations, to deal with institutions that don't intend to comply, or where, frankly, again, the harm is such that it needs to be a public action. I mean, supervision, as I noted, is a confidential back and forth. So that is a different vantage point there, too.
And on the enforcement front, some of the external analysis has found that the number of cases has dropped in the transition of power, and also the amount assessed in penalties frequently in cases. And I think you gave a little bit of nod this to the end of the speech about how do we measure success going forward, perhaps implicit in that the numbers may look a little bit different as we reorient how we go about pursuing the agenda. And I just wanted to give you a chance to maybe respond to that kind of particular argument, which is that the CFPB has, you know the numbers as well as anybody, the CFPB has recouped X billion number of dollars for X million number of consumers. How do you think about that as a metric for success? Is it still something worth pursuing, or do you take a different view?
I certainly think it's something to monitor because, again, all of this information is I think, important to look holistically at the picture of what is happening in the agency. But I just would want to note that transition is particularly a time where you're reassessing. You have now a new director who was not there for the birth of these cases. So getting the opportunity to really have robust conversation with the enforcement attorneys about the cases, how they were built, how they were approached, understanding the parameters more deeply of the laws and violations and how we've treated them in the past. So even permitting for that conversation is something that takes time and results in some of the delay that you would see, and frankly, again, is natural in a transition. You look at how many rules an agency issues right after an administration changes. It takes time. So all of those things do take a little time. I don't want to say going forward that we won't have as many cases or more cases than were filed in Director Cordray's last year, as an example. It's not in and of itself a particular output measure that I'm looking to compare.
And one of I want to ask you about the size and scope of the Bureau as well. So some of the Republican criticisms of the agency was that it was overbroad, overpowerful, too large of a footprint in the regulatory space. Obviously, your predecessor, Acting Director Mulvaney, infamously asked for $0 for the agency's budget at one point. I'm curious what you think about the level of funding at the CFPB and going off of that, the level of staffing. Basically, do you think the CFPB is at the size it should be? How do you think about reshaping the Bureau going forward?
What we're doing right now inside the Bureau, and what I have asked for, is a robust resource allocation discussion and a staffing plan. I've charged every manager in the agency to think about the resources that they need to do the job that I've laid out for them. And I want to have that conversation about what the right staffing level is. I actually am not, I have no goal. There's not a goal to reduce the staff. There's certainly not a goal to increase the staff to the levels that were targeted, prior to the administration change. So it is something that very much needs to be based on what we believe we need to execute the mission that we have most effectively.
I wanted to give you the chance to respond. I am sure many people in this room saw there was a story in the New York Times yesterday that detailed the efforts to revisit the payday lending rule, and just basically it was characterized as a, quote, one in which strategic neglect and bureaucratic self-sabotage created versions of agencies that seem to run contrary to their basic premises. To start with, I just want to give you a chance to respond to kind of the general thrust of the story and some of the claims contained in there.
I'm not usually in the business of commenting on any particular story, but I would say that there's at least some laying out of a certain number of facts that lead different people to different conclusions when they read them. I can tell you what the Bureau is doing going forward. Obviously, we do have reconsideration of the payday mandatory underwriting requirements rule. Comment period is still open, so we are still very much taking feedback on that. The delay of that, given an August deadline while we're reconsidering, that makes that challenging to comply with. in the midst of that is something that, again, we're going through the comments now on. So it is an open rulemaking. It is one that I have pointedly said I am open to seeing what comes in, and we want to make the best decision possible based on the priorities I laid out.
And much of the story was focused on the actions taken by your predecessor, Acting Director Mulvaney. Obviously, you worked closely with him at OMB, and I'm just curious, now that you've had a few months in this role yourself, can you give us any indication on how the CFPB going forward may look differently than how he had operated? What are some of the distinct differences that you might pursue going forward?
He and I agree completely that we had very different responsibilities and goals as we approached this job. I am in the place now as a permanent director with a 5-year term, with the opportunity and, frankly, my background and the reason why the president selected me for the job to begin with. And I'd like to think the reason why Congress confirmed me is because I am focused on managing the institution to conduct the mission that Congress gave us effectively, efficiently, and appropriately. And that is really my entire focus.
And speaking of the 5-year term, you've had a few months in. Are you thinking that you're going to last the full 5 years? Have you given any thought to the duration of it?
Well, there are a lot of things that can happen between month 4 and year 5, but it is certainly my intention to serve the term.
I'm going to turn to a couple of questions from the audience. We have a robust selection here. Actually, we'll just start with this one going related to something we just talked about. Former Acting Director Mulvaney often said something to the effect of that the CFPB should adhere to the statute but go no farther. Do you agree with that approach?
Certainly, the law is what guides us. It gives us, again, our purpose, our objectives, the tools that we have. And so that is absolutely where we are. The one thing I would say is that the 18 federal consumer enumerated statutes are a really interesting compilation of things over time. Even the discussion in my speech about the FDCPA and how you take that forward, given the legal regime. Absolutely, we act within the parameters of the law, but there is some opportunity to be thinking about and even proposing changes to that.
A specific one here, could you please comment on the status of implementation of Section 1071 of the Dodd-Frank Act? That's the collection of data for small business lending.
Yes. I noted this symposia series in terms of the way that we're thinking about dealing with challenging issues. I've talked to a lot of financial institutions and even the consumer advocates and folks inside the Bureau about the challenges of taking on that particular mandatory rulemaking. I'm a little concerned about the impact on small business lending to begin with by the collection of that data, but it is something that Congress directed the Bureau to do. So I can tell you we are definitely looking at what the next step might be to explore that issue.
And you addressed this a little bit in your remarks, but the idea of look-backs of significant rules at the CFPB. Previously, that was primarily in the mortgage space. Is there room for that to broaden out under your purview? Do you think you'd like to be taking a look at more of the work product out of the agency?
As I said, there are 1,750 separate issues that came through that call for evidence related to rulemaking. Many of them were, how we review the inherited rules, how we do the assessments, all of those things. It is certainly my intention to lay that out in a more rigorous way in the coming months, so people know what we've tried to prioritize based on biggest impact areas, biggest cost areas. But the general approach is, as I laid it out, I think it is important to continually assess the effectiveness of what we've done and look for opportunities to improve and iterate.
This question here relates to the use of guidance as a regulator. Obviously, that's an ongoing conversation in Washington. I believe you mentioned utilizing some of that in your role. How do you think about the role of guidance? Are you able to do it in a way that provides clarity to the supervised institutions without kind of effectively regulating, without going through a formal process?
Well, there is a place for guidance, certainly, and institutions a lot of the banks and non-banks have talked to us about areas where they'd like to actually see guidance. Mm-hmm. Congress appropriately wants to make sure that the rulemaking authority they've given to agencies, and particularly independent agencies, is used appropriately. And so guidance is not to the same level of a rule. And so we're looking carefully at the things that we can address through guidance to provide, again, some perspective on what particular things in a rulemaking mean, but where it's going further, where it's actually something that we want to hold institutions to, we need to do that in rulemaking.
And at the outset of your remarks, you talked a lot about kind of giving consumers the knowledge and the ability to make the best choices for themselves. How much of that do you think is kind of the key piece of the puzzle? Are consumers going to be able to avoid some of the bad outcomes that we hear about if they just have more education and more options made available to them? How critical a piece is the kind of information and education at the outset versus kind of policing the back end of it?
I do think the front end is critical. It's where I started. It's actually the first thing the Act starts with, too, is education, because we can't be everywhere. Consumers really need to approach things with that skepticism and understanding, what their needs are. But it's also the truth that the government cannot be putting itself in the place of deciding what is best for each individual in their own circumstances and given their financial situation. So I think it's imperative. I think that's a personal judgment and personal responsibility starting point. At the same time, we know where there are violations and where we find them, we need to act too. We have that enforcement tool to use.
And that is just about our time. Obviously, everybody here will be watching closely and looking forward to what you're doing next. So thank you very much for the time, Director.
Thank you very much.
Great to see you.
Now we're going to reset for panel discussion. I'd like to invite the panel to come forward, and we can get a discussion underway.
I thought you were going to stand up there.
Not nearly that official. Looks like we're still waiting for one more panelist to join us, but maybe we could just start by introducing ourselves and kind of giving people a little bit of a sense of their background here. Rick, you want to start?
Sure. I'm Rick Fischer. Yeah, I've been working in the consumer financial services area for 49 years. At the time the Bureau was created, I had a full head of hair, so you can see what the last decade has been like. I was invited to do a study with Eric Rodriguez, who's become a very close friend, on the Bureau for the Council I'd say probably 7, 8 years ago. It was a treat to do that, and I learned a lot, and I'm learning a lot every day with our new director.
Hi, I'm Linda Junn from Americans for Financial Reform. And before coming to AFR, I've been here for about a year in DC, but before that, I've spent most of my career as a legal aid attorney, representing most of the homeowners and other consumers harmed by the financial crisis and harmed by a lot of the predatory practices that the Cfpb has been tasked to protect consumers from. So I'm grateful to be part of the conversation today.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Prohaska. I'm Vice President and Regulatory Counsel at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where I lead consumer finance and a couple other issues. Before coming to the Chamber, I was at the Consumer Bankers Association, which is in this building, so it's good to be back.
Well, good morning. My name is Hillary Shelton. I'm Director of the NAACP's Washington Bureau and serve as Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy. In that capacity, my responsibilities are actually advancing the legislative and political action agenda of the national NAACP. Prior to working for the NAACP, I worked for the United Negro College Fund. As we're thinking about issues of student loans and other issues along those lines, it was very, very important to us as we addressed those particular concerns. But I also had the distinct privilege of probably testifying before the House and the Senate a good dozen or more times as we looked at the challenges and problems that were evident after the 2008 major economic downturn that led to us actually working with both Senators Dodd and Congressman Frank to actually craft what became the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and then the CFPB in those terms and whatnot. So had a lot of opportunity to hear from people as we were going through those challenges and actually sitting with the lawmakers to begin crafting some protections that will help everyone as we move forward.
Well, thank you so much for coming and offering your expertise. Obviously, a lot to think about from the speech. I think there's a high degree of interest here, given that the CFPB is a relatively new agency. We have a new director, a lot to learn about where we may be going in the years and months ahead. And Rick, maybe I'll just start with you. I'm curious, what jumped out to you the most as kind of the most significant thing that Director Kraninger had said, both in terms of what may be the most significant, and also what's the biggest departure from how things had previously operated?
Well, to me, the most important thing was that she's looking forward. What's the future? Where is the agency going to go from here? I've worked very closely with people at the agency through a director and an acting director, and I think that each had their strengths, each had their weaknesses. And the benefit, frankly, for Director Kraninger of Mick Mulvaney is that he exploded the agency. And I don't mean that, if you think about it in fintech terms, he was a disruptor. In that context, that's a positive term. I'm not suggesting that everything that he did was positive. There were things I agreed with, things I did not agree with. But he's cleared the air in many respects, and that gives the new director the opportunity to look forward. That's the key.
Linda, I know that you're listening closely for any hints of policy shifts to come, allocation of resources, et cetera. I'm curious, what jumped out to you as what's going to represent a market shift from the way the CFPB had operated under Director Cordray?
I know that, I'm grateful that Dr. Kraninger is focused on, she's mentioned a lot in her speech about preventing consumer harm. But everything she said about enforcement, I think it remains to be seen. She said she will go after bad actors, but, in references and veiled references to the previous regime, it seems that there's lots of concerns about that. And I think my biggest concern is that predatory practices will go, there'll be softer enforcement, which means there'll be less deterrence, which will lead to more people being harmed. And that's a concern I have, but I think it remains to be, we'll continue to monitor that.
And Kate, what jumped out to me in her remarks is a lot of talk about taking input from all stakeholders, the idea that everybody has something to contribute to this conversation. And I think there are probably some people in the industry who view that as a shift from the prior regime, where they felt it was maybe a little bit more adversarial with the agency. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this idea that the industry and the regulator can somehow work kind of in conjunction with each other to pursue a common goal. Is that kind of a good place for the regulator to be heading?
Well, being one of those people in industry who is welcoming that change, we are excited to actually have a seat at the table this time around. And I think it's important to note, her focus on supervision. There's a lot that's going on constantly that is confidential. So I think that while the previous leadership, before Mr. Mulvaney, focused a lot on the headlines and kind of attention grabbing, and I understand that from being a young agency, they kind of, they had to be the cops on the beat and hey, we're here. But I think that taking, a more market approach, and I mean, for years, I've written countless comment letters on regulations. Using that tool and putting in parameters and working with industry to see, what works and what doesn't. I mean, just from a business perspective, understanding, if this happens, then this is going to be the consequence. I mean, a really good example right now is what's happening in remittances. Some countries we literally don't know the fees because there's no feedback. So if you aren't talking to industry, you wouldn't necessarily know that. So I think it's definitely a good place to be at. I mean, having all stakeholders at the table is very valuable.
And Hillary, one of the areas that Director Kraninger opened with was this emphasis on consumer education, empowering consumers to make the choices that best suit them. Director Kraninger noted that they've launched a savings initiative to encourage people to build up their emergency reserves, kind of implicit in that being that if people have a better financial footing, they may not end up having to pursue some of these products that fall within the CFPB's purview. I wanted to get your thoughts on this notion of educating and empowering consumers to make choices as perhaps the most effective way to kind of ensure that consumers are protected. Is that, how much important is that? Is that a sufficient tool?
Well, let me say it's a very important tool. Yeah. And certainly it's important that the consumers are educated on issues that help keep them out of trouble and other things along those lines. But protection's also important too, and accountability is extremely important as well as we think about the role of the CFPB. So having one without the other leaves gaping holes and opportunities for discrimination and predatory practices and other issues along those lines. So you have to have both.
And toward the tail end of her remarks, Director Kraninger talked about how do we measure success in an agency, particularly one that seems to be shifting away from kind of the very black and white enforcement heavy approach where we pursued X number of cases that resulted in this amount of money recouped for consumers against this number of institutions, and suggesting that there's going to be a more kind of nuanced way of looking at the regulator going forward. Maybe Linda, we can start with you on this. Is it possible to have as effective a regulator, or is there any way to even tell if the regulator is as effective if we're shifting away from kind of such a binary way to measure what the agency is up to?
I think that's a really hard thing to measure. I mean, one thing I was thinking about with complaints, if there is a reduction in complaints, there could be a number of reasons for that. So number one would be what she was saying, right? There's actually less harm, and I would love to see a universe where that's actually true. But you'll have to forgive me for some amount of healthy skepticism, just seeing clients, especially the least sophisticated consumers who I represented for many years, and some of them, it could also be because they have less faith in the system that the complaint will do anything, or that there's less knowledge about that system, or that even the way the complaint database is, let's just say the questions are changed and it's harder to navigate. It could be any of those systematic issues. It could be that there's different categories of harm that aren't necessarily captured there. There's so many reasons. So I think it's a harder question to answer in terms of prevention of harm. But I think it's really dangerous to say that less enforcement or less complaints it means that there's less harm. I think that you'd have to look at that so much more carefully, and it's important that the Bureau and we as a public continue to do that and look at it from all perspectives.
And Kate, I'd be curious to get the industry's perspective on the enforcement piece specifically. I mean, obviously, the dynamic under Director Cordray was a certain way, and we've now had over a year with the new administration in charge. Has there been a noted shift in the dynamic? I mean, what is your sense from what you're hearing from members or other stakeholders in that arena?
So I think it's interesting when I read news reports that basically the agency's been gutted and everything is different, and there's a kind of the decks have been cleared. I talk to members all the time who have issues going back to the beginning of the Bureau. And so kind of what's happening on the day-to-day, whether it's in the supervisory or enforcement, they'll have MRAs that are open since 2012. Things like that are still very much going on, but it's not as splashy and exciting to see. So I think it's going to be, I'm excited that she's going to be using all the tools in her toolbox. And I think education really, I know it kind of sounds fluffy in the fact that financial literacy, but I mean, that to me is the biggest issue, is getting ahead of the problem. I mean, let's look at healthcare. Like, we want to prevent things as opposed to measure things with, how many dollars did we spend in emergency rooms last year? It's like, that's not the right metric to be looking at. And it's usually, the people who get ahead of problems before their credit goes awry, that are better in the long run. So, I don't think that there's been a halt in enforcement actions at all. I think, one, there has been a lot still going on, and two, this has been a year and a half of transition. Like she said, it was, Mr. Mulvaney looking at it, now the director. So I'm sure, just because there hasn't been splashy headlines doesn't mean that there's not more going on.
And Rick, maybe I can ask you this. And this has already been noted in the conversation, the idea that as a brand new agency, there was a kind of very kind of active, almost aggressive stance to kind of really establish a footprint. Obviously, the rule writing process is a lengthy, arduous process. And what we're now hearing from Director Kraninger is a seemingly renewed focus on establishing the practices and protocols of the CFPB through formal rulemaking, rather than trying to kind of establish boundaries through enforcement cases or using other tools to kind of set the parameters of what proper activity is. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the seeming renewed focus on, we're going to have symposia, we're going to take input, we're going to sit down and write rules to define what abusive is, to define basically all sorts of different characteristics of the CFPB's activity. What is that going to mean for the agency going forward?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, if you look back historically, I agree completely that an agency that's just starting up wants to make its mark. They want people to recognize they're there and they're doing their job. At the same time, there are lots of statutes out there that they have authority over, the agency does, that can be enforced, and they were enforcing some. The actual rules, when you think of Director Kraninger saying, we want clear rules of the road, when you enforce a statute early on, you make your mark. When you set guidance in an enforcement action as your rules, you confuse everyone. I've spent my life advising financial institutions, and when those initial guidances were coming out, they were impossible to understand, let alone to describe to people. Enforcement is essential. I mean, I believe that to my heart. Education is not enough, but it has to be enforcement of rules that people can understand.
Got it. Linda, I wanted to get your thoughts on this this notion of complying with what Congress lays out, but then kind of leaving the discretion going forward. Is there any, what's your kind of expectation for the regulatory output of the CFPB going forward? I mean, it's been relatively slow so far, but I think we've had the point that it's already been a period of transition. At what point are you going to feel like you have a sense of what the Kraninger CFPB is going to actually look like? Are we going to be having the same debate in a year, or are we going to know fairly quickly early on how this agency is going to be operating under her leadership?
I mean, I think, when Director Kraninger was confirmed, we all, and I continue to want to keep an open mind of how she will operate, but I think the biggest item of concern that's happened in the last 3 months is the release of the Payday repeal proposal. And talking about input from all stakeholders, that was an arduous rulemaking process. That was 5.5 years of collection of, industry, consumer advocates, civil rights groups, payday lenders themselves, consumers who have been harmed by payday lenders. The entire spectrum of people had a chance to contribute, and lots of evidence and lots of research at the Bureau. Lots of resources were invested in that, and so I think that's the biggest cause of alarm, and that's one of the first major thing she's done in office, and I think that's I think we're all concerned with that direction.
And it wouldn't be a panel discussion about the CFPB if we didn't talk about the structure a little bit. And obviously, Director Kraninger is now in, and she even mentioned it in her remarks, that there's incredible power handed to the director. And maybe I can just open this up to whoever, but I'm curious what people make of the single director structure now that we've had some time under 2 different administrations with that. Obviously, Director Cordray was able to make a lot happen in a relatively short period of time as a single director, and now we're seeing the other end of that coin come through. And as people who have various interests in how the CFPB operates, I'd be curious what people think of the single director structure now that we have time to see how it operates in both directions.
Let me start with that, if I can. That was one of the issues on the table when we did the study early on. Should it be a commission? Should it be a single director? And you talk about a political issue. My deal with Eric Rodriguez was if we couldn't agree on a topic, it was not in the report. This one is not in the report. When we talked to different groups, both industry groups and consumer groups, we said, you know, if you have a single director, it can twist and turn and change in a hurry. And somehow that just didn't get through. We've seen it already. Once, I think everyone, regardless what your view is on commission versus single director, we've seen what happens. My personal view is a commission would be better after Kraninger's 5 years.
Just to add to that, yes. You know, I was very surprised going to the Hill after President Trump's election that other people weren't clamoring for a commission, because, I mean, as we could see, the agency is so personality-based, and I think that is bad for consistency for financial institutions, because it is kind of this pendulum swinging back and forth. And I mean, that's a perfect example why there's been so much intrigue about what is she going to say, what's her position. You know, I mean, yes, Chairman Clayton's speeches are highly regarded, but I don't think there's as much of an attention because he's dealing with a commission. So I think that it serves consumers better because there's a little bit more, you know, parameters around it, and it won't be as kind of personality-based.
Mm-hmm. Let me disagree just humbly with my friends.
We need some controversy.
Absolutely, thank you so very much. You know, after going through certainly all the hearings and discussions about whether we should go with a commission or go with a single person as head of the agency, after watching how things work and even the process and issues that this agency has to address, being able to be more nimble is extremely important. As we look at issues in many of these very predatory consumer products that change very quickly. As a matter of fact, what's fascinating about them is many of them will change by name only and then pop up a different way. Having a quick response to that is extremely important. If we look at other government agencies, it's not inconsistent. And even though they say there's no accountability, I can't believe I've seen any government agency head come before the U.S. Congress more often than the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So the oversight is very clearly there. So I would argue that the need, after the debate, the discussion, looking at a commission, looking at a single person running it, looking at other government agencies that carry out very broad responsibilities like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, from the Attorney General of the United States to, quite frankly, the secretaries of the various agencies of the U.S. government, I see no problem in one person doing it. And certainly, in each of these cases, in my conversations with both Ms. Kraninger as well as even Rich Cordray, there's usually a group of people around them. They're part of the agency. They participate in the process of helping them make the right decisions. But there's one person who will be held accountable for how those decisions are made, and that will be the director.
Yeah, Director Kraninger herself talked about the agility and the ability to adapt and respond to things was vested in a single director, and I think that single director structure is what makes it possible for just to follow up on what Hillary just said, it makes it possible for the Bureau to respond to those changing practices and bad practices as well.
And speaking of directors, I'd be curious to get the panel's thoughts on what has jumped out to you as the biggest shift from Acting Director Mulvaney to full-time Director Kraninger. I know, Rick, you kind of mentioned the idea that Mulvaney came in as a disruptor, but now we have a couple of months of Director Kraninger, and we can contrast how she's handling the job versus how Acting Director Mulvaney handled the job. And I'd be curious, you know, how do people see her filling that role differently, and what might it mean for the Bureau going forward?
Let me mention one thing just to set the record straight. 2017, Cordray had 36 enforcement actions. In 2018, Mulvaney had 11. That's, no question, is a significant drop. And already we've had 7 in 3 months. This time around, I see enforcement continuing. I see enforcement continuing as part of a focus on rules rather than guidance. In fact, not just the Cfpb, and I'll use that term, the Cfpb, in this particular context, but also the prudential regulators agreed that guidance was not to be the basis of enforcement actions. That's a September a statement that went out from all the banking agencies, the Credit Union Administration, and the CFPB. I think that's critical. Clear rules of the road.
Just again, subtle disagreement, but love having these kind of conversations. As we're looking at many of the challenges we've had along the way, the concerns for us is the slowness of action. That in many ways is very thoughtful to me of what happens when you've decided that there's some problems with how things are working. You've decided that you don't want to fully enforce the law as it's written, that you're not using the full guise of power that comes along with an agency like this. So certainly as we talk about rules, and rules are very important, and we certainly testify and submit testimony before the whole rulemaking and regulatory process all the time. But the use of guidances for quick changes, as we're looking at, again, the very fast nature of our economic society, is something that's also crucially important to have in your quiver as well. So in essence, we're looking for a broad set of rules, a broad set of tools that give us the opportunity to address such a pervasive problem in our society.
And maybe now we can turn a little bit to some of the specific items on the Cfpb's agenda. Linda, I think you already mentioned the ongoing efforts to revise the payday lending rule. And obviously that's one of the most significant projects currently in train that we're aware of. I'd be curious to get the panel's thoughts on this notion of the Cfpb under one regime finishing up a rule and then the next Cfpb coming in and then very quickly turning around before it's even been effective and tweaking it. Is that a helpful way to go about regulating it? And specifically on the payday piece of it, what do people make of the changes that are being put forward by the Cfpb to the change to the underwriting standard?
I mean, one of the biggest questions I have is payday loans in 2019 versus payday loans in, 2012, 2013, 2017. I mean, the Cfpb leadership has changed, and things have changed in Washington as far as leadership is concerned, but I haven't seen anything, besides the reinterpretation of a study that they'd already looked at length, but payday loans themselves have not changed, and the evidence around them, the mountain of evidence, 5.5 years of collected evidence, that wasn't like they only got one part of the story back then. That process, as Dr. Kraninger has said in her going forward, that got input from all stakeholders, and so I think the biggest question I have is, besides the change in leadership, what has changed that would warrant a change in a rule that went through the proper rulemaking procedures?
Well, I'll quickly add to that, and so I would say the payday rule, as it's 1,600 pages. There's a lot of nuance that comes in that. So it doesn't mean that, we're going to completely gut it and different things like that. But I think that, I've talked to institutions that literally cannot comply with how it's currently written. So what changed, I think, is being able to digest it and looking at the implementation process. And we saw what a mess TRID was to implement and the fact that it needed to be pushed back. So that's kind of my first point, is looking at the system implementation and saying, oh, August is right around the corner and we need to see if we could actually implement this particular provision. Another piece that isn't being reassessed is the covered loans provision. And I think it's figuring out that wealth management products are actually covered by that. And that's not the quote-unquote UDAP that again, being deemed the quote-unquote payday rule was intended to cover. So if you have a $300,000 bridge loan, that is technically covered by the payday rule. So I think it's different parts of the bank understanding, oh wow, now these products are covered. So both it's the system implementation and then being able to digest and having legal departments actually talk to one another.
See, in our experiences with the payday rule, it's fascinating to see how things have moved along these lines as well. I've had the opportunity to actually meet with a number of owners of some of the biggest payday lenders in the country. As a matter of fact, I sat in my office with the largest payday lenders trying to figure out how I warranted sitting down with a guy that is a multi-billionaire, as he is. And as we discussed the issue of the payday rule, payday challenges and problems throughout our society, which is most heavily in communities the NAACP serves. As I did not mention, I think that we have 2,200 membership units, and we're in every state in the United States. So we're hearing from one end of the country to the other, and even military members, not only on bases in the United States, but also in Italy, Germany, Korea, and Japan. But with all that in mind, the single thing that each payday lender or their representative said to me in our conversation was simply that under any other guidances, we would not be able to maximize the kind of profits that we make now. So as you think about the protections for the American consumers, what they were saying is those protections you're asking for, I just wanted to have a moment to explain to you, Mr. Shelton, that I can't do business that way because I can't make the level of profits I'm making today. So as we're thinking about what payday loans actually end up paying out in the equivalent of interest that they call fees, we're talking about over 400% interest over the course of a particular year. So we understand and appreciate those particular issues. But of course, most of the challenges and problems we have with the predatory nature of many of these financial services products is they simply cannot maximize the kind of profits unless they're able to, at some level, be able to take advantage in a predatory way of those who would do business with them.
So if I could add to that quickly, so I think that it goes, I mean, Payday Rule is quite a misnomer. This goes across the financial services spectrum, and you know, this prohibits banks from getting back into the market. I think that some will remember the FDIC and OCC deposit advance guidance, which basically brought all of the banks out of the market as well, and this isn't getting them back in. So we have the OCC saying we want banks back in the market. We have the FDIC having their request for information, and then we have the Payday Rule. And I'll go back to what Director Kraninger said, and I use this stat all the time because it's horrific. The fact that 40% of Americans can't foot an emergency $400 expense, where are these people gonna go? So, you know, if we aren't getting banks back into the mainstream kind of small dollar lending market, you know, what are the alternatives? And I that's my main concern.
Well, let me say, I would agree. I'd love to see the banks in the small lending markets and whatnot, but I'd like to see them in a very disciplined way that does not take advantage and otherwise create a predatory scenario that we're talking about here. So we've had a number of conversations, and even looking at products that quite frankly aren't as predatory as many of the products we see at many of these payday lending stores, and even some of the packages coming from some of our banks. It was amazing to see the banks actually duplicating what we're seeing happen in some of these payday lending stores across the country, and shameful in many ways. I don't want to name names now, but
because I have very good research on our.
I'll whisper into your ear the way some of these banks actually went around even some of the state protections to utilize in their federal status to be able to put in place payday lending packages that were not supported at that state level, but indeed they were able to do it again because they utilized their federal.
I've just seen some that were like very highly regarded. So we'll talk.
Buy me a drink, I'll tell you.
Sounds good.
I mean, just going back to like a family can't foot a $400 emergency, and the answer to that can't be a $400 loan at 400% interest.
Yeah, there's
and so there's, and I think there,
and that's where
and there, you know, hopefully there are, and I would love to see a world where there are alternatives that are not that for people, and I think that's kind of what we're all talking about, right? A world where, but like that can't be the answer, and I think that's the concern.
Some of the credit unions, quite frankly, even offer packages that are much more sustainable and not nearly as predatory.
Go ahead.
One area that we haven't talked much about is the idea of innovation and the role of a regulator in that space. Obviously, the Cfpb is taking strides there. You know, the notion of a regulatory sandbox that allows private industry to kind of try out different things in that space without worrying about the hammer coming down on them. I'd be curious to get the panel's thoughts on how a regulator like the Cfpb should think about innovation. Is it an asset? What are the risks that come with pursuing that sort of approach? I would welcome thoughts on that.
Let me start it out in a couple of ways. First of all, I think of innovation, I think of new products. Alternatives to payday lending, and also deposit accounts that are sustainable. Those are new products. And also think about meeting the future and the ability of companies to be able to deliver what they need to deliver in terms of disclosures and the like. The Office of Innovation at the CFPB previously was made up of really, really good people, very interested in meeting, but were able to accomplish almost nothing because they didn't get the support from the top that they really needed. They were great people. One single no action letter that essentially went nowhere. That can't be if there's going to be a future in this area. If Director Kraninger talked about existing regulations, think about the Truth Lending Act with all of these disclosures, and how do you deliver that on a cell phone? How do you deliver it on a payment device in a merchant location when somebody is going to get a loan at that minute? It may be a new credit card account, it may be an installment loan, that minute. The disclosures are worthless in terms of an educational tool. They may be an enforcement tool later on. It's critical for the agency to develop an approach that's meaningful for disclosures on iPads, cell phones, and other ways to make the market work.
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead, and then I'll jump in.
I would just add, pre-clearance is a good idea. So in essence, if there are products that they're concerned about, maybe predatory in nature, and create problems along those lines, having a division of the CFPB that can evaluate it prior to implementation and determine whether they're going to have problems will be consistent with other tools that we utilize, even in the voting sphere, to address these kind of concerns, and again, prevent them from happening in the first place and make sure our consumers are safe.
Yeah, and what we've been looking at is what other agencies do. I mean, the SEC, the CFTC, they've been issuing no action letters for decades. And I think that there hasn't been massive consumer or investor protection harm, coming out as a result of those. And they've used some of those no actions to inform rulemakings. So that's what we would like to see from the Bureau. And I hope that it's looked at as more than simply just innovative products. Because to Rick's point, I mean, there's a lot of outdated laws that we just need some kind of thoughts on or disclosure. But on the innovative side, I just would want everyone to read the Philadelphia Fed report on the Madden case last fall. I mean, the fact that when marketplace lenders went out of New York and Connecticut, bankruptcies rose 8%. It's these people who really need that access to credit and can hopefully be able to have access to these products in order to, further their financial wellness.
I mean, the one thing I would like to add is, innovation needs to be looked at very carefully. The Bureau can't, this idea that regulations, first of all, is it a new product just because it's on an app, right? There's a lot of questions there, and there's, I obviously mobile bank, there's lots of good things that have come with technology, but there's also, is there any unintended consequences? I think there's lots of times companies can mean well, and we don't know, and so if there's going to be, the innovation needs to be looked at more carefully and not less carefully. There needs to be reporting, there needs to be public input. All stakeholders, again, need to have a chance to be able to observe what's going on and know what's going on to take a look at all of that. And so there needs to be more oversight and not less as we talk about how the regulatory framework moves forward.
Yes. Okay, great. I think we have some time for a couple of minutes, I believe, for some audience questions, if anybody had anything that they want to chime in.
Hi. Gosh, you listen? Hi. My name is Caroline. I am a licensed bilingual social worker. I come in all the way from Boston once a month here, so I do speak Spanish and French, so I'm able to talk to my seniors in Boston about a lot of issues. But one thing that is a big concern for myself, that I am a senior, and for many of the seniors, is that you people, you beautiful people who are in this Cfpb group, I have not heard much about health for seniors. Everyone thinks that when you are 39 years old, you're going to die and all the problems are gone. Not so. We have a lot of seniors, including myself. I have a loan from a school that was $4,000. Now my last bill that I got is $39,900. $39,900. And no matter how much I try to figure out how I'm gonna get this situation straightened out, they keep changing us from one beautiful person to another. We keep changing from one president who, for whatever I feel, is not that great. That is my personal feeling. But my feeling is also that we need to have a woman as a president, believe it or not. This is my feeling, because we women are able to do better job in Washington than the people have been able to do at this moment here. I'm not going to go with my story any longer, but I will ask you gentlemen up there in the end to give me your card, and I will send you all my information and see if you are able to do a little help. Thank you so much, you beautiful people, for being here. I come all the way from Boston, believe it or not. I don't miss these meetings because they're wonderful. But everyone should think about every one of us and the seniors. We are all getting old, and if we don't get any help, where are we going? Thank you.
And I'm happy to give her my card, by the way.
Sure, absolutely.
And recognize some of the challenges as we're thinking about the various financial services products and the various kinds of consumers we have in the country and the various circumstances they're in. So certainly as we're thinking about our retirees and those who are getting up in age and whatnot, we have to think about their challenges a little bit differently. And having an agency functioning the way it should be, recognize the diversity that is America, including the demographic you speak of, is essential.
Absolutely. And the Cfpb held an event recently on elder abuse, and I could not agree more. And thank you for your work as a social worker. My mom's a therapist and a social worker, so thank you very much. And another issue that you brought up was student lending. I think that is a huge issue that we need to address. I mean, the U.S. government has $1.5 trillion out in student loans, and I think that that's another way where we could, work together on that.
Yeah, and I wanted to say I also appreciate that she highlighted a lot of the problems that come with the student lending, the servicing problems, the statements, and all of the tools that the Bureau has can really address can really help improve that process.
I think we have time for one more question in the back.
We'll repeat the question if you want to. Okay.
There we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Leon Peace. My question is, with respect to payday lending issues, what about, or is there any way to require or increase the requirement on credit unions to develop products that will fill that space in terms of payday lending and in terms of other credit rehabilitation type products? Certainly there are a number of, on the more predatory side, there are products, but isn't there a way to start requiring that credit unions, in support of their tax-exempt status, offer people with more challenged credit these products?
Let me start out on that one. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. There's a Community Reinvestment Act that applies to banks across the board, to credit unions in a different way. It's under reconsideration right now. And it seems to me that one of the ways that you can help address issues with respect to small dollar short-term loans is to encourage financial institutions which are regulated, which are examined, to do it. The Cfpb is not going to be able to do it on their own. They just cannot. But with the help of the banking agencies, they can do that. So I agree completely.
I would just add that we've seen some pretty decent products coming out of some of the credit unions, including my credit union attached to my church. So in essence, I would strongly support that, and certainly incentives established by the federal government to provide the kind of support that they need to be able to provide the protections, to be able to provide these kind of loans at low interest and better terms, I think is extremely important. And I think it's well worth doing.
And on that note, I believe that's about going to wrap it up for us. Thanks so much to the panel for a really great discussion. Appreciate it, guys.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Sarushian. I head up the Financial Regulatory Reform Initiative at BPC. In addition to our panelists, I want to thank Director Kraninger and the CFPB staff for help making this event happen. I also want to thank the BPC team, especially Dora Engel and Ariane Arias, for helping make this event happen. I also want to plug an event we have next Tuesday. We hope you can join us at BPC as we welcome another senior administration official, Diane Jones, who's the Principal Deputy Undersecretary for Higher Education at the Department of Education. She will be here discussing issues relevant to the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, which is currently being debated in Congress. With that, thank you, everyone, and hope to see you soon.